The time, 18. Shot, Jordan, Michael Jordan.
Collins driving, almost lost the handle. Chalmers for the tie. Got it with 2 seconds. Unbelievable.
3 seconds at midcourt.
Jenkins
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship.
Hey guys, I'm Jackson, and today I'm starting a new college basketball news show. I'm a sophomore in college, and my favorite college team is Seton Hall. And Ben, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Ben. I'm also a sophomore in college. The team I support, I'm a big UNC fan. So, yeah.
So basically, this is going to be a show where I'm bringing you the latest college basketball news. Every once in a while, I'll have a guest on. So today I have Ben. Maybe I'll have a different guest. Sometimes I won't have a guest. Maybe I'll have Ben again. But we'll basically review all the news that's happened in college basketball in the next week. So right now it is Thursday, April 23rd. And so this is all the news coming from Monday to Thursday. And then the next episode will have all the news from Friday to next Thursday. And so we're going to talk about the biggest college basketball news. So the schedule for today. So usually we would start with our college basketball experience, but obviously due to the coronavirus, we haven't had a lot of exposure to college basketball lately. So we're going to skip that today, and we're going to talk about players and their eligibility and highlight a few of them, players who've declared for the NBA draft. Then we're going to look at transfer and recruitment. And we're going to get this week, players who've declared to transfer this week. We're going to look at players in school, and then we'll also scheduling news after that. On to questions regarding you guys can post one of them with the news of Jalen Green. So to start, one of the players, arguably the biggest name to keep his name in the draft this week was Elijah Hughes of Syracuse. He's a junior. The Orange weren't going to make the tournament last year, but he did have 19 points per game, 4.9 rebounds on 42% shooting. Ben, you go to school near your Bears fans, so what do you think about this news?
So I think this is big for Syracuse overall. They're losing a lot of shooting here. And that was one of their big things. They obviously have one of their top recruits from last year, Joe Girard, who's a big three-point shooter, spreads the floor a lot. Also, Buddy Boeheim shoots a lot from beyond the arc. And they still do have those two guys staying, which is good. It'll help keep their shooting up. But losing 19 points a game, almost 37 minutes, that's going to be hard to replace. So it'll be interesting to see what Coach Boeheim does with this, losing that outside shooting.
Yeah, very interesting because Syracuse does have a ton of good guard play because me and you both have a friend, Billy, who goes to Syracuse, and they have very good guards. But ever since they lost their starting center, I think, to graduation a year ago, they've really struggled. So interesting to see what they do with that.
Yeah, that's the main thing with Syracuse is having a big man to help stretch out the floor. They need someone inside that creates the space for the outside scorers.
So arguably the biggest name that declared for the NBA draft, though he did maintain his eligibility, was Baylor's Jared Butler. He was an All-American third team last year, and probably the one player on the All-American teams that not a ton of people knew about. But he was arguably the best player on a team that sat in the top two for a majority of the conference portion of the season. Averaged 16 points per game, 3.2 rebounds. We're going to talk about another Baylor player later who's returning to school, but do you think that Jared Butler is going to stay in the NBA draft? And if he returns to Butler, do you think they have a chance at being a one seed? They probably had a good chance at a one seed this year. Do you think they have another chance of being a one seed if they return everybody?
I think Butler's a big part of that. I mean, he played 30 minutes a game. Obviously, you mentioned the scoring, the All-American third team. And like you said, Baylor was a good team throughout the year. They were always one of the top seeds. If he does declare for the draft, I think it's possible he goes later in the second round. He won't be a super high pick. So I think he ends up staying, and I think that helps Baylor a lot maintain that core. Those returning him is huge for them, and will definitely probably be the favorite for a top 10 seed.
Definitely. I mean, Baylor, until they lost, I cannot remember the team they lost to. I think they were upset by TCU. They were sitting pretty strong at number one. And, I mean, Jared Butler was a name I had not heard of until pretty late in the year when I was starting to look at Baylor for the NCAA tournament. And then he's on the All-American third team. And he's really the spearhead behind a very well-rounded team.
Definitely.
And then, so the next guy we're going to talk about in depth and the last guy in terms of eligibility we're going to talk in depth about is Alabama's Kira Lewis. It's a sophomore point guard who is gone, so he is headed to the NBA. And he had a really good combination with Petty, averaged 18.5 points per game, 5.2 assists per game. For a team that really did struggle, he dropped 30 points against Vanderbilt. So we know that, I know Vanderbilt's not fantastic, but 30 points a game is no small feat. But overall, he's a pretty big part of this team. How much do you think Alabama suffers this year, Ben, from losing him? Because they did hire Nate Oates from Buffalo, and last year is his first year. Do you think Alabama can overcome losing Kira Lewis to be pretty solid next year?
It's gonna be hard. Like you said, he was first team All SEC. He was fifth in the conference in scoring. He was third in the conference in assists, and he has a lot of talent. That's gonna be hard to replace. He'll probably be a back end first round pick. I'm hoping he falls to the Knicks at 27. I like him as a player that they could draft. I think he'll go a little before that, but it's gonna be hard to replace that volume. 18 points, that's a lot of scoring.
He was really solid, especially coming into conference play. He had been really solid. And now the question remains whether Petty goes, the other guard on Alabama, whether he goes to the NBA
That's
draft.
very true.
Kira Lewis was expected to kind of leave, but Petty is on the fence, and that could be a big part of
swaying his decision. Yeah.
So we're not going to talk in depth about the remaining guys, but there are some other important guys that did declare for the NBA draft, and we'll talk about them fairly briefly. We're not going to go in depth. The first one, and going in no particular order, we're actually going to be going more chronologically, is Steph Smith, who was a junior at the University of Vermont. He averaged 14.2 points per game, had 20 in the American East semifinal against UMBC, and so it might not sound like a huge name, but Vermont's best player from last year, Anthony Lamb, who hit a game winner against St. John's, he is graduating. So if Steph Smith does end up returning as expected to Vermont, he could play a big role. He could play a big role in that team, and he can honestly propel himself into an NBA draft while gaining his eligibility. Also, Arkansas sophomore Isaiah Joe declared for the NBA draft. So he averaged 16.9 points per game. And 4.1 rebounds, and for a good majority of the year, Arkansas was a bubble team. So he was playing a big role in a team that was winning games. And the fact that he can still return is pretty big. They already lost Jalen Harris, who was a grad transfer who went after this team was pursuing actually just Georgetown. So they're lost some guards coming in. So it's interesting to see you return or that guard. And some other guy to highlight is I bet his decisions he's a junior guard who was arguably the best or second best defensive player in the Big East behind Romaro Gill. And to add on to that, he averaged about 17 points per game, 5 rebounds, 1.3 steals. Ben, I want to ask you, because Creighton was really hot at the end of the year. They were co-Big East candidates in the East tournament, good to see. But not only Alexander, I think last week the news came out that Davion Mintz from Creighton was grad transferring to Kentucky, and Pony actually declared in the draft. Creighton's lost 3 guys. Do you think they'll favor these guys, or do you think they're not getting cousins?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question?
Do you think that Creighton is still the top team in the Big East as they were expected to, or do you think another team can come in and steal that?
Losing Tyshawn Alexander definitely makes it so that I don't think it's definite they keep the top spot. The Big East has a lot of good teams, and that was shown this year. They were going to have a lot of tournament teams. And he's a big player for that team. He led the team in scoring. He had 41 steals. Like you said, he's a great defensive player. And I think losing that gives other schools the opportunity to jump Creighton.
Definitely true. Villanova, a few weeks ago, they had Sadiq Bey declare for the NBA draft, so they're waiting on him. And Creighton will also return Marcus Zagorowski as their point guard, so they will have a solid amount of talent returning. But next year felt like the year, and we're going to actually talk about in the scheduling, bit of Creighton's scheduling. They had some big games on their schedule, and next year felt like the year maybe they could make the step. So 5 more guys that we're going to briefly go through that also that we felt like our viewers should know about that also declared for the NBA draft. All of them, though, are maintaining their eligibility. So the first one is Corey Kispert. He's a junior forward at Gonzaga, only averaged 13.9 points per game and 4 rebounds. But when you do that on a team that arguably was in the top 5 in the nation for most of the year, it does grab headlines. So he's a big name that declared. Another one is the University of Central Florida. Actually, 2 guys declare for the NBA draft. They had Colin Smith, who was a big man, 12.6 points per game, 6.3 rebounds. He was a junior. And they also had Jalen Green, who was a freshman who averaged 10.1 points per game. You would expect both those guys to return, but the AAC is going to be fairly wide open next year. So the fact is that if they return and UCF gets some more pieces, we've seen them make runs before. We saw them push Duke to the limit in the NCAA tournament. So they have some good coaching there as well. Also, another AAC player, Chris Vogt, 7'1" center from Cincinnati, averaged 11 points, 5.9 rebounds. He also declared for the draft. And then also another AAC player. The AAC really had a bunch of guys declare for the draft this week. Tashawn Hightower averaged 15.9 points per game, 4.6 rebounds. He also declared for the draft. All those players, though, did maintain their eligibility. And so that's the end of the keeping the eligibility of the declaring for the NBA draft section. And now we're going to move into the transfer and recruitment section, which is just as rampant at this time. And so the first player we're going to talk about is Matt Harms, who actually committed this morning. He's a 7'2" center from Purdue who chose BYU today over Kentucky and Texas Tech, averaged 8.6 points per game and 4.6 rebounds, and also hit this game winner against Indiana while he was at Purdue.
Durham staring at Edwards. Edwards fading away. Tapped by Harms. Gotta get back.
And so I'll bring the question to you, Ben. Do you think that Harms is going to make a big addition to BYU? Obviously, Kentucky was pushing him pretty hard. Their tallest player on the roster next year is going to be 6'9", barring them adding another transfer. Do you think that BYU? Do you think this? How much do you think this will help them? But even more importantly, do you think they can push Gonzaga for the WCC title that Gonzaga usually they walk into the title? Do you think they can push them this year?
I mean, Harms is a solid addition. I mean, obviously, his scoring was kind of low. His stats look a little low, but he's a solid big man. He gets you 2 blocks a game, and he's playing for a good coach. I mean, I think that it'll definitely help BYU a lot. Pushing Gonzaga, I don't know. Gonzaga's a powerhouse. And the BYU is losing 3 starters, I'm pretty sure. And that's a lot to make up. And I don't know if you could count on this one guy to make all of that up, but it's a solid addition for that team.
Definitely. Because Kentucky was highly expected to land him up until a few hours before his decision, and BYU kind of came in and stole it. And he said he's a grad transfer, so he'll be eligible next year, and he could certainly make a big impact. Gonzaga's adding some talent. Even if they lose Kispert, they're adding a 5-star recruit in Jalen Suggs. So adding some talent. Another big transfer that decided this week was Landers Noley. And if you haven't heard of Landers Noley, well, this guy was transferring from Virginia Tech. He averaged 15.5 points per game, 5.8 rebounds per game, shooting, and he was part of the All-ACC freshman first team. So he was highly touted, and he chose Memphis, who had fairly high expectations for them last year until they lost James Wiseman. Ben, do you think that Landers Noley, it's going to have to – do you think that he can make himself a top AAC? Do you think his recruiting could make Memphis a top AAC team?
So this is a big get for Memphis. I mean, like you mentioned, that scoring. He scored 20 points in 4 out of his first 6 games. He scored 22 points against Michigan State in that big upset. I mean, this is big for Memphis. They were one of the teams that were going after Jalen Green, and obviously he decided to go to the G League system. But I think this is big for Memphis. They're trying to reload after getting 3 games out of James Wiseman and not getting the top recruit overall. So I think this is good for that team.
100%. Landers Noli was arguably the top player in the transfer market at the time.
Definitely.
A lot of top teams looking at him, and the fact is that Memphis got him. Surprised he transferred in the first place, but it's a big get for Memphis. Some other recruiting news. So 2021 four-star point guard Issa Silva decided this week. He decided on the Stanford Cardinals of the Pac-12. The Pac-12, after having a really poor 2018-19 season, really reloaded this year. A lot of teams that we didn't expect to look good, mainly UCLA, really came out and were pretty strong. And in addition to Issa Silva, earlier this year, Stanford landed five-star recruit, and I might pronounce this wrong, Zaire Williams. So they have already added a bunch of talent, and Stanford could be a force to be reckoned with, along with Arizona State, who also added a five-star recruit, Josh Christopher, last week. And some more news. Another player that has decided to transfer is Jalen Coleman-Lands from DePaul, who actually got a sixth year of eligibility, and this is his second time transferring. So he started at the University of Illinois, he transferred to DePaul, and now he's going to be transferring again. And if you remember his name, it's because he actually hit a big game winner against Texas Tech last year that you can see right now.
They're going to give it to him. Coleman-Lands! Oh, they should have.
So Coleman-Lands, he's going to be a big name on the market. And another guy in the market that'll be a pretty big name is DeAndre Williams from Evansville. You probably recognize Evansville because they had that big upset over Kentucky last year. Well, if that was the last you heard of them, it's not surprising. They went 0-18 in MVC play.
Very impressive.
Conference play. Yeah, which is extremely impressive. I looked over their schedule, and in about half the games were fairly close games, but at the end of the day, their head coach did get fired due to sexual assault allegations, so they did have that going on. But DeAndre Williams was the bright spot for that team. He had 15.2 points, 6.9 rebounds per game, and he unfortunately is headed out of Evansville. He'll be a fairly big name. And then a guy that me and Ben definitely want to talk about that actually just cut his list before the show is Marco Santos Silva. I got to see him in person and transfer from VCU. And I actually got to see him play in the Atlantic 10 tournament at the Barclays Center, and he had 26 points and 22 rebounds. So this guy was a beast. He averaged 12.8 points per game and 8.9 rebounds at VCU. And he actually just cut his list to Ole Miss, Georgia, Penn State, Maryland, Arizona State, and Texas Tech. So, Ben, I know it's probably a bit early in the process for prediction. Do you he changed program and be the one overall guy, or just these complimentary?
So I mean, you watched him go off, and that's an impressive stat line. He obviously has the potential. I mean, you look at him, he led VCU in points and rebounds. He almost averaged a double-double. I think he's more of a complimentary piece. I don't think he's a guy you can rely on to be a consistent number one option. But he is a very good complimentary piece. I mean, 13 points, 9 rebounds, that and like you said, the ability to go off for 26 and 22 in the tournament. He was named to that A10 all-tournament team. And I think whoever gets him is going to be lucky to have him. And I think he's better suited as a complimentary piece, but a good one. So nothing to laugh at.
And it's bad news for the A10 after having such a great year out of Dayton and Richmond. Unexpectedly, Richmond went 14-2 in the Atlantic 10 last year. It really hurts for a program like VCU that's so perennially good and did make the NCAA tournament 2018-19. So some other guys that are also declaring, that are also transferring, are Hawaii has a grad transfer, Drew Buggs, and average 9.4 points for 5.4, 4.5 rebounds. Those grad transfers really double. So he is actually close to Iowa State, Missouri, and Illinois. So really and then we also have Jalen Johnson, another grad transfer from the University of Louisiana Monroe. He averaged 15.5 points per game. That's another guy who also just cut his list. I'm not going to list the list though, because it is about 10 teams. But it is Joe Bridgen, a freshman from Holy Cross. Holy Cross really struggled last year, but he averaged 17.4 points per game and 6.8 rebounds per game. So a lot of big names putting themselves on the market. The transfer market in recent years has become a really good way for high major teams to get new recruits, and it's really a problem for low major teams. And so next up, we are going to look at some of the players returning to school. And the first one that me and Ben are going to discuss is Isaac Lakele. I hope I said that right. Like Kelly. He's a sophomore at Oklahoma State. He averaged 10.9 points per game, 5.6 rebounds per game, and 4.5 assists per game. So a fairly solid player. But when you add in the fact that Oklahoma State added Cade Cunningham, who is, along with Jalen Green, one of the top 2 players in the nation. Ben, can Oklahoma State make a run in the NCAA tournament? Can they be kind of a sleeper team, or do you think they're going to fall flat?
I think they can. With him returning, not only does that keep a player that was kind of crucial for them on the team, they have a top 5 recruiting class for this upcoming season. I mean, I think it helps them a lot. Obviously, you mentioned Cunningham, the number 3 prospect according to the ESPN Top 100. I think they could definitely make a run. I think they're a team that not many people might talk about, but they have the talent to get it done. And I don't know how to pronounce it, but him returning, that's big for the school. And I definitely do think they can make a run.
Usually I'm not huge on 5-star recruits, but the number 1 and 2 players in classes tend to live up to expectations. While the 8 or 9 guys sometimes will fall flat, I mean, usually the 1 or 2 guys at the very least are going to be a first-round pick in the NBA. So you add someone like Cunningham, you add a guy like, I mean, I think the best way I can compare this is when Duke has a bunch of stars on his team and it has someone like Quinn Cook or like Trey Jones returning, kind of that solid centerpiece. And when Oklahoma State's good, they're good. It's a really tough place to play, so that's definitely interesting to see. And so then some other guys that also decided they are returning to school, the 2 main ones were Mark Vital from Baylor. And so if you look at Mark Vital's stats, he probably isn't going to set the world alight. He's got 6.1 points per game, 6.2 rebounds per game, but he is a fantastic defender. He arguably was the 2nd best defender in the nation last year. The only problem was the number 1 defender in the nation was also in the Big 12, Marcus Garrett. So he took home the awards. That's a really big addition to Baylor. And obviously we talked about Jared Butler before, see if that changes and see if Baylor can return the whole crew. And yeah, it's pretty big. And another name, Franz Wagner from Michigan. He just declared that he is returning 11.6 points per game, 5.6 rebounds. Michigan kind of had the biggest roller coaster season you can think of. They went from unranked to number 4 to unranked again.
Yeah.
They were going to be in the tournament, but returning Wagner, that's obviously a very solid, that's solid production that they get back. And so that is all the eligibility and transfers, and that's just from the last 5 days. So now we're going to move on to the scheduling news. And the main scheduling news that came out this week was the Big East Big 12 Challenge. And so the list should appear on your screen right now, but I'm going to highlight these 4 major games that you probably want to look out for. We have Villanova at Texas, Creighton at Kansas, which obviously I was alluding to Creighton's schedule before. That's a really big game. For me personally, Baylor is at Seton Hall, which is why I'm so interested to see what happens with Baylor's players returning, because I could be seeing a top 5 team play my Seton Hall Pirates or a team that will be closer to 25. And then the 4th one, kind of the sleeper game I think that people should watch out for, is West Virginia at Georgetown. I think that'll be a really good game. Ben, are there any of those 4 games or any of the other games on the slate interest you? Obviously, the Big 12 only has 10 teams, so UConn is not participating because they're just being added to the Big East. But do any of these games in particular really interest you?
I think, like you said, Seton Hall Baylor is going to be a big one. You get to see how Baylor's big players who return, how they perform, and like you said, it'll be interesting to see what they're ranked based on how they perform. And they have some recruits too. They have 2 top 60 recruits that are coming in. See how they do. That'll be a matchup to watch. Definitely a good matchup to watch there.
Definitely. I mean, I'm a fan of these challenges. I know very recently that I'm not sure if it's still going, the Gavitt games between the Big Ten and the Big East. But these challenges are a really great way for teams to get high major competition on their schedule. So there's a lot of interesting games. Another tournament that was announced this week was the 2021 Battle for Atlantis. So some of the schools so it's obviously now this is the next year, some of the schools participating: Michigan State, Syracuse, UConn, State, ECU we just mentioned, Loyola Chicago, and they said an 8th team to be determined. So that'll be definitely a really good field. And other scheduling games we can talk about are Maryland versus St. Joe's, LSU versus Houston has a home and home, SMU versus North Florida, and LSU versus Hofstra. So those are some games that I'd keep your eye on. Maybe some of those teams don't sound so appealing, but North Florida was very sneakily good last year, and Hofstra won the CAA. So those are some games to keep an eye on as well. And so now we are going to dig into depth about 2 questions before ending the episode. And so the first one we talked a little bit about before was Jalen Green announced he is going to the G League, which obviously sent huge shockwaves because he was a 5-star recruit, top 2 player in the nation. And then in addition, the G League is reaching out to prospects from the class of 2021. So, I mean, Ben, Terrence Clark was really the figure of criticism because he was considering it as well. In the end, he decided he's returning. He's going to go to Kentucky. He's a 5-star recruit this year. Do you think the G League is going to steal players like the NCAA, or do you think that this isn't really a big issue for the NCAA?
I actually do think this is a big issue for the NCAA. Jalen Green is a big name. He was the number 1 recruit, and he's choosing to not play college basketball. And those are the guys that the NCAA needs to get. I mean, this is putting even more pressure on them after states had already tried put pressure on the NCAA to get compensation for their athletes. Jalen Green is going and he's getting a contract. He's going to be able to get endorsements, and whether or not he pans out, it's still big because he is the number 1 recruit and he is choosing not to play in college. And I think this could be a sign of things to come. Other players are going to start considering this now that someone as big as Jalen Green decided to do it. And like you said, the G League is reaching out to prospects in 2021, and I'm curious to see if those prospects do end up going. Another prospect that I think is big to watch is Dior Johnson. He's one of the top recruits of the 2022 class. He is a 5-star. He's committed to Syracuse right now, but I don't think he ends up playing for Syracuse. I think he will take this deal, or at least try to play professionally. By then, the rule might even be changed. So I think this is a problem for the NCAA, and I think it's put some more pressure on them, more heat on that fire that's burning.
And that would be deja vu for Syracuse because they obviously lost Darius Beasley to the G League, which was the big first name kind of to drop. But Beasley was more of a borderline 5-star, high 4-star recruit. Jalen Green is the top player in the nation. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. But obviously that's something that we really wanted to mention in this episode because that is something that it might be a problem for the NCAA that isn't exactly going away. And so the last question, this is a bit more fun question. So actually, I didn't mention that I thought are worth mentioning right now. And once again, I'm probably going to butcher the names, but Jetty Juzapatis, he is transferring from Flagler, which is a D2 school, to Georgia Southern, and he averaged 19 points per game. And Kovasor Macaulay is transferring to DePaul from Lincoln Memorial. He averaged 20 points per game, and Lincoln Memorial is also a D2 school. And then adding White, who plays for Spurs, was the first round pick, started out at D2 school. So, Ben, the question I pose to you is that are D2 transfers really going to become a big thing? Last year, Xavier had a guy named Zach Haskins. I remember he absolutely ran him out of the building. So do you think this starts to become a thing, or do you think that maybe this is just an exceptional year of D2 players?
I don't think it's going to be a common trend to see a lot of D2 players transferring. I think it's definitely possible. It's hard to make that jump because D1 is a different level. I think there may be 1 or 2 guys every year, every couple of years that do make the jump, but I don't think it's going to become a trend. I think playing D1 basketball is pretty hard, and it still is a significant jump, just going from D2.
Well, thank you, Ben, for joining me today. Maybe we'll have you back next episode. Maybe we'll have you back later in the future. But that is all the college basketball news. Obviously, a ton of news from the last 5 days. We'd like to thank you for watching today. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to have weekly videos on all the college basketball news coming out, and we'll probably have updates on these transfers and these players declaring for the draft. And I'll see all you guys later. Peace.